Hi, everyone. We'll just give a few more minutes for some people to join. Okay, we're still receiving some people, so I'm gonna give another 30 seconds and then we'll get going. Yes, let's get started. Hi, everyone, and welcome to this second webinar of the 3-webinar series organized by CBIO. And today's webinar is about the impact of practices on biodiversity. So I'll introduce the topic and talk a little bit about CBIO today. So as I say, it's the second webinar. I'll say it now, we record and share all webinars, so be aware of that. Let us know afterwards if you have any issue with it. And I also ask now, and I'll ask again, if you have a chance to turn on your camera, especially the speakers talk, it helps a lot when you talk not to a blank faces of people who smile and nod. So the first webinar we organized last year was about biodiversity and why it matters, but also how to measure it. I put the link here. You can find more information about this webinar and the video of it. And today we will sort of gear up and move to how agriculture impacts biodiversity. And in the next webinar, we'll talk about the valorization of biodiversity. So altogether, we're interested in why biodiversity matters and how we measure it, how biodiversity and how we can, or maybe we can't give a value to biodiversity. And the schedule for today is after this short introduction, from me, we'll talk about how agriculture impacts biodiversity in an agricultural landscape, and for that we have Niels Holst here, who works in agro, a senior researcher, and we'll follow with Yoko Louise Dupont, also in the Department of Agroecology, talking about promoting in agricultural landscape in Denmark, and in particular ecometric. And our third and last speaker will be Henrik Hågård Nielsen, who will elaborate on intercropping as a case study, and a field diversification agent, in particular the intercrop value project. And the last 20 minutes will be a discussion, so please write down questions if you have any, and we'll take a general discussion then. So before we start with the talk, we wanted to tell you a little bit more about CBIO. So CBIO is a interdisciplinary center within Aarhus University. So it's really a collection of departments who share interests for circular bioeconomy, and in particular, so the science, but also the industrial and societal impact of these things. And so you can see here we have quite a few departments involved. And originally, CBIO is built around strongholds in agricultural research and focus on biomass conservation, so upcycling and such. But we also have increasingly interest in biodiversity. So CBIO creates value with this interdisciplinary research and innovation, and the focus is really to shift away from fossil-based economy towards bio-based society. So as we want to focus on this mission, we realize we need more and more to think about biodiversity, and in particular how it interacts with agriculture. And in the first seminar, we measured biodiversity and expressed why it matters, but now we want to move on and think about agriculture as the most impactful human activity. For instance, if you think of Denmark, this is quite evident. And this is a bidirectional interaction insofar as agriculture impacts biodiversity through things like habitat loss or pesticide use, and also in indirect manner through global warming, but also biodiversity impacts agriculture. And that could be if you consider services provided by biodiversity, such as pollination, but also disservices, and less directly, biodiversity can be a source of genetic resources to benefit agriculture. So in the first webinar, we asked whether any agriculture is actually compatible with biodiversity, and we discussed whether it's better to sort of compress intensive agriculture and leave the rest untouched, or actually have agriculture that is biodiversity promoting. And today we'll discuss, thanks to the speaker, more about approaches that can promote biodiversity and how do we actually make that happen. That could include things that you know very well, such as agroforestry, intercropping, and so on. But the most important point is to discuss whether what we try to implement to consider biodiversity works, and there are of course different ways to measure biodiversity at different levels, but ultimately it's which dimension of biodiversity do we prioritize, and how do we move to these measures of biodiversity and these observations to actual decision making and implementation. So to start this topic, as I said, we'll have Niels hosts now. And then Joko Louise Dupont, and finally Henrik Holger Nielsen. So if we don't have any questions immediately or technical issues, we'll move on directly to Niels. And as a reminder, please, if you can show your allow your camera to show your image. Thanks.
Thank you, Quentin. See if I can get this rolling. Okay, I guess you see my screen now. So I'm happy to see you all from all over the country and even other places around the world. So it's very common nowadays for scientific publication to give a kind of a graphical abstract. So today I present no title, but I just left this graphical abstract. Biodiversity is important to humans. It makes life more interesting. We might have ethical obligations to preserve biodiversity. At the same time, we need agriculture to feed us. So there's some interest here that we need to reconcile. The Danish landscape now, it's some call it a green desert. In this season that you see pictures from here, it's more like a yellow desert, maybe, as the crops ripen. And in this green desert, you have little islands, little oases like this burial mound. We still have a lot of those interesting habitats. We have less than beforehand because most have been plowed under for farming. Anyway, I'm going to take a personal view on agricultural biodiversity today, starting with the landscape that I grew up in, which is this landscape. So this is western part of Zealand, where I grew up. Is in Høng. I was born there, and I'm going to tell you a tale of this landscape that I grew up in, and later I will turn to another landscape. That's where I live right now, south of Sorø. So if we go back in time to when I was born, well, this is a bit before, in fact, that's when my father was born. You have this map of the landscape. And if you go forward to when around I was born, there's not that much of a difference. Let me flip back. Old days, I was born, no revolutions caused, not immediately. But if we step forward 25 years, things have changed. You might want to focus, for instance, in the upper left of this map. This is modern times, old times. If I were in front of you as a live audience, I would ask you to call out what's gone. What is gone is a lot of waterways, ditches, hedgerows, gone. So that happened during the Green Revolution in the 60s, where agriculture got intensified, took up more and more place, farms got larger, and yields increased. So as a boy, every day I walked from the farm to the school, and in those days, so that's 1970 or so, I was 9 years old. Along the road edges, there were lots of wildflowers. I could pick bouquets of those for my mother when I returned from school. There was bees buzzing and butterflies and grasshoppers, whatever. In the fields, there were also wildflowers. Farmers would call them weeds, but they also sustained a lot of insects and wildlife, and the insects then again served as food for the birds, like partridges, yellowhammer, whatever. So you could say at that point in time, you could have agriculture and biodiversity in the same area, sharing that. But there was some ominous things going on. I saw this guy only once. It was passing over, and he couldn't find a place that was worth nesting. Even though there was some water left in the landscape, there was not amphibians, frogs, whatever, enough. So that lived in those years, that species. If we go back a bit further to when I was born, to Sorø, so that's central Zealand. At that point in time, it was the year before I was born, my father, who was a school teacher at Høng Kommuneskole, he arranged an excursion to Flommen, which is a meadow in Sorø. It's still there. And he told me later that I'd seen this butterfly asking around there. If you look in the butterfly books of that time, it's called the common swallowtail. If you look at the distribution of the species today and historically, it looks like this on the Tour Basin. So this might not look too bad to you. You see a lot of red dots, so not seen since 2016, but you see also a lot of green dots, mostly easterly. It's not as good as it looks, because whenever anyone sees a swallowtail, it's very likely to be registered on a Tour Basin, because you cannot it's really obvious that this is special, it's beautiful. And another problem is that all of these are migrants from Sweden. So it's in fact very bad, because even though we have migrants from Sweden quite often, there's no way they can settle. The landscape is hostile to them. So that's kind of bad. So we cannot reintroduce the species even if we wanted to. So that was 1960. So when I turned 14, I went with my friend Kenneth on bicycles, and we pitched a tent in Sorø Sønderskov. I had brought my butterfly net so I could go out and catch butterflies, and sure enough, I caught some of these. They were all over the forest together with other species, and I was happy about that. I looked it up in my butterfly book and put a few specimens on needles. I still have them. I don't do that today. I use my camera if I want. So what's the distribution of that species today? It looks like this. The green dot that you see there is not Sorø Sønderskov. It's Store Bøskov, just north of Sorø. This is weird. So why is it in one place and not another? If you go to Sorø Sønderskov today, you can see there's nothing amiss here. I mean, the flowers are here. Everything is okay. Why has it gone? What's happening? So some years later, 20 years later, I bought a house right here, just south of Sorø. It's on the border of the forest. It's facing due south. My garden is full of wildflowers. I got a piece of land there. And when I moved there, I was so happy about all the butterflies that I found in just around my house. So 2 years later, sadly, this species disappeared and it never returned. And then again, today, I hardly ever see these species present in my garden. I lived there 30 years and I can see no change in the landscape around me. The farmers are doing their stuff. The owner of the forest is doing her stuff. Everything is the same, except species just disappear. That's weird, and it's really frustrating because how can you fight something when you don't know what's happening? I should add that when insects disappear, so do the animals that feed on insects. This was nesting every year for 15 years or so, but I'm afraid that now it's gone and I haven't seen it for 10 years. It usually sat on my line for drawing the laundry. To better understand what's going on, I'm going to... this guy looks kind of... it's løgfrø. Smells of garlic if you disturb it. The blue dots here, by the way, that means that this species was found both before and after 2016. So it seems to be a very stubborn little fellow, keeping on going in its water hole. And this was the object of a study by my supervisor and Tove Hels, and they looked at the population on Djursland, so this area of Denmark, more specifically these 5 water holes that you see right there on a map. The title there says meta population, so that's a population that's divided into distinct subpopulations. So it's quite obvious that if you have animals living in water holes, they would be in distinct subpopulations, but more distinct today than 50 years ago because there are fewer water holes. So in fact, they really are divided into kind of independent units. So these 5 subpopulations were monitored for 4 years. Parameters were put into a mathematical model to see what would happen in the long run. I should mention that the female over here, she produces 1,500 to 2,000 eggs per year. So the population, the dynamics of this species are quite dramatic. This is what it looks like from the study. You shouldn't be too worried that it's kind of, oh, that looks kind of chaotic. It is kind of chaotic. So it's 100 years simulated population dynamics. And you have the number of individuals in each pond and also the mean of that. It's on a log scale. So for every step up the ladder there, you go 10 times, you have 10 times more individuals. So this is really dramatic. So in any water hole from year to year, there would be a huge, there might be a huge difference due to competition, to maybe one water hole is drying out more or less, whatever happens. So that's a natural variation. So this is a meta population. Sometimes what would happen is that toads would disappear completely, water hole. But since there are other water holes nearby, someday female toad would show up, and a male also, hopefully, and then they could resettle that population in the water hole. So now we're also approaching what we're seeing. So why have butterflies been disappearing around my house and everywhere, other species disappearing as well, if seemingly nothing has changed since the Green Revolution? We reconfigured the landscape many years ago, but still it seems to have an impact today, what we did then. Because we're not spraying anymore now than we did then. You imagine spraying would kill a lot of animals, but it's not what is the key problem here. So we're back in the good old days, in the old landscape, where we had plenty of habitats. Maybe these are water holes, and the blue ones and the orange ones are sites good for insects. So you shouldn't think of these habitats as like pristine, very special habitats. It's just edges along the road, water holes here and there, there's nothing special about these habitats. Not at that time anyway. They were quite common. And they were well connected. So individuals could walk or fly however they move from one place to another easily. And even those pathways that I put there in themselves are habitats. I mean, along a road, whatever, or along a ditch. And at any point in time, if you went to a habitat looking for maybe this butterfly species, it might be there or it might not be, but it could be there. And if it's not there this year, maybe next year it would be there. They're just moving around in a landscape freely. So you can always expect, if you spend some time, to find your toad or your blue butterfly if you make the effort. It's unpredictable because it might also there might have been in other places, but all over it's stable, it's viable, the species. So if we now go 25 years ahead in time, after the Green Revolution, what happened was that the landscape turned into this green desert, very productive for the yields, but not for biodiversity. Also, we had fewer habitats left. So now really we're talking about a major population. It might be that the subpopulations are there or present at a point in time, but you know what happens is that when they disappear from one place just due to bad weather or whatever, they never return because it's too distant for the neighboring subpopulations. And then you're left with this landscape, a green desert with a few suitable habitats, but the habitats are not filled with a full complement of species that could be there because they have left the whole landscape completely. So this is what happened in the landscape. It started in my childhood. It was kind of running its ultimate course around my house. So when these butterflies disappeared around my house and the birds with them, it's not because farmers did something special around my house. It's just because these species were doomed at the time the Green Revolution happened. When that was finished, it was just a matter of time. It's a kind of silent death of the animals. You would call it a death by statistics. It's just a matter of time when species disappear. Could we then reintroduce a species somehow? So here my daughter, she is reintroducing a jellyfish into the sea after it has flown ashore. So that's a very meaningful activity, and you would spend a very nice afternoon doing that. But it seems like we have some problems because, like I showed you, the swallowtail, once called the common swallowtail, it's trying to do that on its own accord every year, flying from Sweden. It doesn't really work. And since we're now setting our feet into the sea, let me take you on a journey further. This whale here, because we have an even more threatening perspective than just the disappearance of species. This is the species we call Grønlands whale in Denmark. And it lives in two distinct populations. It's not a meta-population at all. It's two populations divided or split by Greenland. And 200 or 300 years ago, they were harvested. They were caught. It was like a natural resource. It was like mining. You needed the oil. So half of the weight of such a whale is oil, and that was used for street lights in the civilized Western world to lighten the streets. So there was a huge demand for that. The red dots are samples where genetic samples were taken. And what you should see and notice on this figure is that this is now year 0. 2 colors are for the 2 different subpopulations. The y-axis is genetic diversity. So before we talked about biodiversity, so a lot of different species present. Here we talk about the diversity, the genetic diversity within a species, within these 2 different subpopulations. So those around Svalbard, those whales were unlucky because they were harvested down to 3% of the original population, but still they survived. Whereas the other one, west of Greenland, was harvested down to half of the population. What you can see is that it's not surprising that during the harvest times, genetic diversity decreased. That's the declining green line. In the 30s, it was stopped, the whaling. There had been some technical innovation on streetlights, so you didn't need the whale oil anymore. What the bad news are here is that if you go 1,000 years ahead, in that period, in the future, genetic diversity of this whale species will still continue to decline, even though we stopped. We have built up a momentum in a negative direction, and there's no way we can stop it. I don't know if we could move a whale from the west coast to the east coast to help those Svalbard whales. But otherwise, this is bad news. The whales, as well as the Danish landscape, is facing climate change. For species to be able to withstand in this during these climate changes, you need genetic diversity. But we have been reducing that. So even where our species are still present in Denmark, here and there, the genetic diversity has been reduced as well. So they will be more vulnerable to climate change, less likely to stay with us. A female whale needs 25 years to become a mother. Insects are much quicker than that, 1 or 2 generations per year. So we don't need to look 1,000 years into the future for those, would make no sense. But still, this is bad news for us. We lost genetic diversity and it seems to be irreversible. Somebody has to do something about this. And in Denmark, we have the Green Tripartite Agreement. I found this illustration there at the bottom. And if I was in front of you as a live audience, I would ask you, so which political party do you think produced this picture? Yeah, I'm certain that if you give it some thought, maybe even an AI could come up with the right answer to this, because you have a tractor right in the middle. It's Venstre. So what you see there, you see flowers, and it's a nice maybe route for insects, whatever, to fly around the landscape. Agriculture is still dominant, and you have the crown deer and heron, whatever. Okay, so we all have different perspectives on what the green tripartite means, and also what parts of biodiversity are most important or interesting. I found this brochure. It's from Danish farmers organization, Østdansk Landboforening. It highlights what the green tripartite is about so far. So before the green tripartite, we had the CO2 action plans. They have a global scope. The green tripartite has a local scope, in the first instance focusing on nitrogen, which is a main pollutant. It's a pollutant causing loss of biodiversity, and in fact also loss of human lives. That's another issue. What you see here at the bottom is how much nitrogen you can capture in different ways. The rightmost one, I think it looks a bit too positive, but I'm not an expert on mini wetlands, all of this. But I can tell you that I have colleagues at the Department of Agroecology, and they are behind numbers such as this. So if you want to find out these numbers, how to do that, I will refer you to our colleagues. So in my section, I'm leading the section for agricultural biodiversity. We're focused on biodiversity, and that's not yet part of the green tripartite. There's a new law. It should have been launched in 2025, Nature and Biodiversity Law, but it's delayed, so it should come through this year. I think that's my personal view. I think the problem with biodiversity as a political goal or just political topic is that it's difficult to quantify. It's not like CO2 or nitrogen. It's just diversity of some sort. And what kind of creatures are we interested in preserving and furthering in the landscape? So that's not so much scientific discussion. It's more, you could say, an ethical, political, pragmatic discussion. So what kind of biodiversity should we enhance? But we need ways to monitor and to measure that, and that in fact is the topic of the following talk. At this point in time, or right now, it's my final slide coming up. I think it is important to find out, so what do we mean? What's the value of biodiversity? Well, we have a good economy in Denmark, and I think that's because we are very good on the market. But biodiversity is not a market commodity. So I think we should ask the future generation, what's the value of biodiversity? And I don't think they will answer in terms of monetary value. It's something else, and that's what we should aim for. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Niels, for this inspiring talk. We have time for a couple of questions now about specifically your talk. If you want to ask a question, please raise your hand, and we'll tell you. If you don't have time, you can also write the question, and we can read them out, and Niels can also answer after. I think we have a question from Anne. Anne?
It was by accident I raised the hand. I don't have a question.
Okay. So maybe I can ask a question. I thought it was very interesting that you talked about the landscape connectivity, but you also mentioned the genetic aspects of it. I was wondering to what extent we can see that some species that are better at dispersing or at moving, whether they suffer less from sort of insular landscape compared to species that are very sedentary.
When the landscape changes and when changes are then exaggerated by climate change, as it is now, it's exactly those species that you are mentioning that will be favored. That includes pests. So we see the swallowtail here and there, that butterfly. We see the painted lady coming all the way from North Africa every year, invading Denmark. So these species that are good at moving, good at dispersing, they will be favored in this landscape. I'm certain some researchers have studied this, but I'm not into it. It's an interesting question. Yeah, it's a research question. That's what we like.
Great.
Hopefully also it can be used for promoting biodiversity in some ways.
Thanks. If someone has time for a short question, Morten?
Yes, thank you, Niels, for a really nice and personal presentation about your where you lived a lot of your life. I was wondering your point about that we depleted the genetic pools of a lot of species by removing closely related habitats. And your point about the whale is that is really difficult to
recover.
Do some to recover and do something about. But so how do you see the way forward? For example, if we are so good at the Green Tripart agreement, implementing also biodiversity in that and establishing hopefully better and better connected habitats, how good are chances for reintroducing some of these species also in larger scale?
Will just be from Denmark forever. Hopefully live somewhere else. But like places like now this is not like the big landscape, but places like Lille Vildmose where they are restoring that habitat, which is special. They were surprised, botanists and others, how quickly some species would reinvade and just thrive. If you put up a small 1 cubic meter water hole in the garden, you're surprised how quickly it is invaded by animals still in the landscape. So I'm really keen on having a landscape back where biodiversity is just everywhere, like in my childhood. I mean, we were producing food then also. So we can do that again. Maybe make less money, but we can make money in other ways in this society. So I think we should not be paralyzed just by analyzing this. We should just do something. So cut the drainage pipes, stop plowing, put up some fences, release some cows and ponies, whatever, and see what happens. It can only go in one direction. Biodiversity is so low now that just removing agriculture for some place is going to be a tremendous step forward. So don't be too much of a scientist here. Just make the politicians do something, because it's going to be much better whatever we do if we change things. And then we can monitor, and then as researchers we can analyze what's going on once we do this.
Thanks, Niels, for this pragmatic answer. In the interest of time, we'll move to Yoko now. As a reminder, please, if you have questions, write them in the chat and Niels can answer whilst Yoko is speaking. Thanks.
Okay, can you see my presentation now?
Yes, we see and hear you.
And you can hear me as well. Okay. So I have been invited to present our project Ecometric, which is an ongoing project which aims to develop a concept for a farmland biodiversity metric. And it's a presentation that I'm doing with my colleagues Trine Poulsen and Gabriel Thommer. I hope Trine is here today so that she's a programmer and she can maybe help answer some of the more technical questions. And Gabrielle is a social scientist, and unfortunately she couldn't be here today. But the Ecometric project is a research project in the Organic RDD program. This program supports research in organic food and production systems, and it's funded by GUDP and managed by ICROS. And this particular project is a collaboration between the Interdisciplinary Research Center CES, where I'm affiliated, and Trine as well. And we do computer simulations to predict long-term changes in biodiversity. And then our other partner is the Innovation Center for Organic Farming. And they have developed this biodiversity-focused farm advisory service for organic farms. Good. So I'm very happy that Niels gave this very good introduction about biodiversity in agricultural landscapes. But really biodiversity includes all the variation of life, including both birds and animals and microorganisms. But in this context, I will also talk about the diversity of traits and functions. In Denmark, there's a very strong focus on biodiversity in pristine nature areas and nature conservation. And this report, which is entitled More, Better and Larger Nature Areas in Denmark, is focused on the existing nature areas and forest areas, which is this map to the left. And then they point out continuous areas which can be prioritized in conservation. And these areas are in connection to the nature areas which are present today and which contain a high concentration of species, and in particular many rare species. And at this point, I would really like to stress that we do not question this prioritization, because this is really where we find the highest biodiversity in terms of species numbers. But in this presentation, we will like to focus a little bit on the more lighter colored areas here on the maps, which are mostly agricultural areas. Because many of the landscapes in Denmark, they look like this aerial photo. This particular photo is from the north of Aarhus. And what you can see is that the area is dominated by agricultural fields. Then there is also a bit of forest and also some urban area. And there's also some nature, but it's mostly in between these agricultural fields as small fragments. And such a landscape is quite representative of the general land use in Denmark. And this figure is the area distribution from Statistics Denmark. And what you can see is that this large blue part of the circle, that's agricultural areas. So agriculture covers around 60% of Denmark. And that has not changed historically. And then the orange part is open nature, and that's only around 10%. And only 1.6% is actually protected nature. So we would like to focus on these 60% of agricultural area, because this is a huge area where we could maybe make a difference for biodiversity. Okay. So agricultural landscapes, they are quite variable when it comes to farming intensity and nature content. And these two figures, they illustrate sort of two extremes. So if we look at the illustration to the left, then you can see that this is a very highly intensively driven agricultural landscapes. So the fields, they are large, and there are only some small natural areas, and you have few edges, and even the edges are not very much nature. And the agricultural fields themselves, they're also intensively driven, so they are plowed and fertilized and sprayed with pesticides. In the other scenario here to the right, you have cropped and non-cropped areas much more integrated with one another. So you have larger nature areas here, and also in between the fields, you have a lot of semi-natural areas like edges, like field edges and hedgerows. And even the fields themselves, they're more diverse. They have strips and so forth. So the scenario here to the right, they promote biodiversity much more than the scenarios to the left. But of course, these two are just extremes. So you also have all these kinds of landscapes somewhere in between. And the organisms that we focus on in the ecometric project are those living in the agricultural landscapes. And they are animals living both in the cropped areas, but also the non-cropped areas in between the cropped areas. And these include large organisms such as mammals and birds, but also a range of invertebrates. And the organisms, they include birds, organisms such as farmland birds and pollinators and grassland butterflies. And those are actually the focal organisms of the European Green Deal, including some of the strategies. So the biodiversity strategy and farm to fork strategy from 2020, and also the recent nature restoration regulation. They have particular targets for these organism groups. Okay, so one requirement for having biodiversity in agricultural landscapes is that there are some habitats where these organisms can live. So for instance, if you have an agricultural landscape, then you may have some field edges where you can have beetles and spiders, and also maybe some hedgerows where you have nesting places for farmland birds or maybe flowers for pollinators. So OECD, which is the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, is a global organization, and they have been developing this habitat biodiversity indicator. And this indicator measures habitat diversity rather than species richness. So, and that is actually much more simple because the species are not always present, and also you will need to have someone to identify the species and count the species. Instead, in the habitat biodiversity indicator, you count the number of habitats. And the ecometric project follows this habitat biodiversity indicator approach. And the idea is that if we have a rather boring and monotonous landscape with a low biodiversity, then you can add some new habitats, such as, for instance, creating strips of flowers or of grass or bare soil, or maybe even a hedgerow, which is a perennial structure. Or you can take out a larger area and set it aside. And then you can create new habitats for a range of different organisms. So in other words, we're developing a metric where we can quantify the potential for agricultural biodiversity by adding these new habitats. And in this way, you can also credit farmers for their biodiversity-friendly management efforts. But there are some challenges to this approach. And one is that if you have a farm, and it's this spatial problem, because if you're a farmer and you have this particular farm in the landscape, and then maybe you want to promote biodiversity, so you add a patch of natural vegetation, and maybe you do that to one field, or maybe you have several fields where you leave a patch of natural vegetation. But often it's very difficult to document changes in biodiversity, because these organisms, which live in agricultural fields, they live in the cropped areas, but also the non-cropped areas, and they move between the fields and even between different farms because they use a wider landscape. So really, when we measure biodiversity, what we want to know is what happens at a larger scale. So if you have a baseline landscape without patches, then how much can biodiversity be improved in such a landscape if you add patches to many of your fields? And that would be in a landscape covering more than one farm, possibly maybe 10 farms. And another problem also relates to the temporal scale, because changes in biodiversity, such as changes in populations or also colonization of new species to these new habitats, that takes time. And usually that takes more than a couple of months or even years. So for investigating this, we use computer simulations for predicting long-term population changes of key organisms. And when I say long-term, we mean 20 to 30 years, maybe even longer. And these computer simulations, they work more or less like a weather forecast. So we have detailed knowledge and complex models to predict future weather, and this is how we get the weather forecasts. And likewise, in biodiversity modeling, we use detailed knowledge about factors affecting the behavior and the reproduction of key organisms, and we know this from the literature, and then we use that to build complex models and to predict changes in biodiversity. We use a system which is called ALMAS, which is short for Animal, Landscape and Man Simulation System. And this is a so-called agent-based landscape simulation model. It's quite complex. I will not go into the details, but I would really like to outline the general idea. And here I would also like to introduce my colleague Trine, because she's a programmer and she has been doing all the technical work behind these simulations in this project. So if you have any technical questions, I hope that Trine will be around to answer them. But ALMAS is a complex simulation system, and it incorporates many of these variables which are highly dynamic, and they are in three large groups. So we have our species, which we model. Then we have the landscapes, which are highly dynamic, and then we can model also different management actions. So I'll just explain in a little bit more how this works. So we have our key species, which we know very well from the literature and how they respond to various factors, including those affecting behavior and reproduction. And the key species, they represent different organism groups, including both vertebrates and pollinators. See some of them here. And they also include different functional groups, such as, for instance, pollinators, which can influence production as well because they pollinate crops, but they also pollinate wildflowers. And we also have natural enemies of agricultural pests, which are important for regulating populations of agricultural pests. We then simulate these animal populations within digital landscapes. And these digital landscapes, they're also highly dynamic. So for instance, we can have varying landscapes in terms of the fields changing the crops from one year to another following a rotation cycle. And the vegetation grows during the season on each field by increasing the vegetation height and also by increasing biomass. And I will just show you this small simulation of how the biomass changes during the season. And the lighter colors the colors are the more biomass. So when the fields abruptly changes from light to dark, that is because they are harvested. So this is what it looks like in the simulations. And our landscapes are 10 by 10 kilometers. And what we do is that we use landscapes from the real world. So we use landscapes from all across Denmark, which are 10 by 10 kilometers. And we reuse the structures and the compositions to make it as realistic as possible. Okay. And then we can actually also model these different biodiversity management actions within these landscapes. And that could be both the strips and set-aside, but also the scenario that we discussed a little bit earlier about, for instance, adding patches to a landscape and comparing what happens to the biodiversity compared to the baseline landscape without the patches. And I just wanted to show you one such simulation, and this particular example is the beetle, and we simulate that within one particular 10 by 10 kilometer landscape. And here you can see that each of the light dots is a beetle individual, and in the beginning of the season, all the beetles are overwintering in the hedgerows and the field edges. And then, if I can start the simulation here, you can see that as the season progresses, the beetle, they move out into the fields to feed on these agricultural pests and also to mate. And then in the end of the season, they move back to the hedgerows and the field edges to overwinter again. And then the cycle starts all over again. So the principle is that we do a lot of these simulations, and then we can compare different landscapes and compare different scenarios, and then we can investigate what are the trends when you do these simulations long-term across many years. So I would like to show you how such a simulation study can work, and I would like to show you some brief results from the sister project of Ecometric, which is called Organic Plus, and which has just been completed. So here we use computer simulations to predict long-term population trends of selected biodiversity indicator species, including both spiders and beetles and skylarks. And first, we investigated effects of increasing organic farming area from currently 11% to 25%, which is actually the EU target for 2030. And this resulted in some generally positive effects on beetle populations, but negative effects on spider populations. And this is probably because organic farming means that because you cannot use chemicals to remove weeds, you have to do mechanical weeding. And that is not beneficial for spider populations because they're destroyed. In this study, we also investigated effects of biodiversity-friendly farm management actions, and these showed very high context dependency and variability across landscapes. But increasing non-productive areas generally had beneficial effects on biodiversity, so 4% was better than 2%, 7% was better than 10%, and so forth. And another general result was that strips with high edges compared to the area were better than continuous areas of natural vegetation. So, and also one result was that even the different biodiversity-friendly management actions, they also differed in effects. So for instance, flower strips were beneficial both to skylarks and beetles, while hedgerows were beneficial for spiders, but not for skylarks. So from this study, we conclude that the effects of increasing organic area has mixed effects, but implementing biodiversity-friendly management actions are generally more important to support biodiversity. But getting back to Ecometric, we wanted to assess some more general structures of agricultural landscapes rather than the specific biodiversity-friendly management actions that we investigated in Organic Plus. So one classification system which can be used to characterize landscape heterogeneity in agricultural landscapes has been developed by a large group of authors led by Martin et al. And this study was published in Ecology Letters some years ago. And in this system, the landscapes are classified according to two landscape parameters, where the first one is landscape composition, which measures the amount of semi-natural habitats, that's the green part, compared to the area of cultivated arable land. And as you can see, the more the better. So the landscapes having more semi-natural habitats, which are the green parts, will support higher biodiversity. And then the other parameter is the configuration parameter, which is about the edge density. I think Niels mentioned that if you have many of these connections in the landscapes, then the organisms can better move between different parts of the landscapes. So it is really about the boundary length of the areas. And as you can see here, you have many more boundaries in the upper landscapes compared to the lower landscapes, and that is better for biodiversity. So to map these different area types, we used in Ecometric, we used a mapping tool called Field Ecospace Tool, which is a mapping tool developed by the Innovation Center for Organic Farming, and which is used in their biodiversity advisory service. This tool can carry out a very simple mapping, which is based on relatively few area types, where the most important ones are crop fields, permanent grass, and permanent landscape elements. And these permanent landscape elements are really just areas which are not cultivated, and it is also not buildings or forests or permanent grass. And if you want to know more about these different area types, I very much encourage you to visit the Innovation Center of Organic Farming's webpage, and they have actually just released 3 videos about these 3 different landscape types. They're in Danish, but I think they're very, very good, and you get an insight into what can be done in each of these landscape or area types to increase biodiversity. Good. But in ecometric, we feed each of these area types from the field ecospace tool into the framework of Martin et al.'s landscape heterogeneity concept. And in this system, the composition consists of the area of semi-natural areas, so that would in the field ecospace tool concept be the permanent grass area and the permanent landscape element area. And configuration is the ratio between the edge and the field area for field crops. And so the better configuration means that you have higher edge lengths. And that actually implies that the areas of these semi-natural areas are dispersed more within the landscapes and not just confined to these large blocks. We then use these 3 landscape types to compose artificial landscapes by varying the composition and configuration in landscapes. And for the composition, we use varying proportions of the 2 types of semi-natural areas, permanent grassland and permanent landscape elements. And we use different proportions of these to reflect real-life landscapes. These ranges were based on reports and landscape analysis of Danish landscapes. And similarly for the configuration, we varied the dimensions of the crop fields to include a range of different combinations of area and edge length. And here you can see the different dimensions of the fields. So we have 8 different configurations. And we then made these artificial landscapes by combining our 12 compositions and the 8 configurations to obtain 96 different landscape types. And we then ran computer simulations in each of these landscapes for each of our 7 key indicator species of biodiversity. And we replicated each of these combinations 10 times and 20 times for the hare. And this resulted in more than 7,000 simulations. So these simulations are now used to build an index, the ecometric index, which is based on predictions of how the populations of these selected species develop in different landscape contexts. So if we go back to these 2 different landscape types that I started out with in this presentation, then in this highly intensively managed landscape to the left, which has large fields and small areas of semi-natural areas and low edge density, many of our species are predicted to decline, although a few of them are not affected. And therefore, in this landscape, the ecometric index should have a low score. By contrast, if you have this landscape to the right of the more diversified landscape, where the fields are smaller and you have higher edge length, then many of our organisms will do well and will increase in population size. And in such a landscape, the ecometric score will be high. So our metric is not based on counts of species or the occurrence of rare species, but rather based on predictions of how population trends of key species in agricultural areas develop. And this is a very different approach than the traditional biodiversity monitoring and species conservation in pristine nature areas. I would just like to end this talk by just briefly mentioning the social science part of the project as well, because the metric is focused on production areas. We also aim to build an understanding of biodiversity across the value chain. So we hope to develop a metric which can connect the awareness of biodiversity and the demands among the consumers for biodiversity-friendly products through the availability of products, biodiversity-friendly products in shops and the retail business, through to the advice given to the farmers for doing these biodiversity-friendly management actions, because the farmers are really those who can do the job of promoting biodiversity in the agricultural landscapes. And this way we could connect the value chain to give credits to the farmers for implementing biodiversity-friendly management actions. So to obtain the input from various users, we have presented draft versions of the metric to a stakeholder group and co-developed the metric with them to include their views and also to facilitate the acceptance of this metric. And members of this group include workers in producers and retailer organizations, agricultural organizations, financial organizations, municipalities, and also some NGOs. And these members of the stakeholder group have participated in interviews and workshops during the project. And the social science part of the project was done by Gabriel Thoma, a colleague who is now in the Department of Management. And unfortunately, she's not here today, so I hope you can contact her directly if you have specific questions. But I just want to present very briefly what the interviews contained. So firstly, the interviews were asked about their expectations for the ecometric. So what did they hope to obtain from participation? Secondly, she asked them about their understanding of biodiversity on farmland. So what biodiversity meant to them, and also to assess whether they or their organization has an influence on biodiversity. The third question was about the use and reporting of the biodiversity metric, whether a biodiversity measurement would be useful to them and whether they were aware of something similar being reported. And then finally about measuring biodiversity. Which biodiversity indicators did they think were most important, and why should biodiversity be measured on agricultural landscapes? So I will not go into the details of the interviews, but just very briefly outline the stakeholders' expectations. So the first expectation was to obtain a useful metric, which is reliable and reflects a common understanding across the supply chain, and also that it is built on a scientific foundation. The second expectation is that we use clear and specific criteria, for instance, for decision support, but also for communication across different levels and consultancy across different levels, from farm level to regional levels, and maybe even across the EU. Thirdly, something which was important to the stakeholders was that the visibility of effort, so that biodiversity-friendly measures are visible, not only for enhancing biodiversity, but also to create incentive and reward for those doing it. And then finally, the stakeholders highlighted the importance of good collaboration and communication between both the stakeholders, but also dissemination to the wider public. The interviews also showed that there's a great need for a farmland biodiversity index for reporting agricultural biodiversity in the business world. And in Denmark, we have this Center for Strategic CSRD, where CSRD is an abbreviation of Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. And this is a center which supports companies for creating value with the new EU requirements for sustainability reporting. And they have written a report, and biodiversity was actually one of the EU sustainability measures here, which both lacks subject understanding and also lacks documentation in the business world. Okay, so I'm approaching the end of the talk, but the interviews also laid ground for a common workshop where we presented our technical work with the ecometric metric, and we also got some input from the various stakeholders, both positive and also the negative input. And if you would like to know more about the workshop, there was actually a paper published in this magazine called Økologisk Nu. It's online, and this paper is from the 2nd of June last year. And I would just like to end the talk by mentioning all the many project participants and stakeholders involved in our projects. Without them, this project could not have been carried out. And I also want to mention our project Organic Plus, because many of the ideas developed further in Ecometric actually started in the Organic Plus project group. And if you're more interested, please visit our websites. We have a project website in ICROFS and also in the EU SES webpage. And you're always also welcome to reach out to me. Yeah, so I think that's it from me. And if there are any questions, I will be happy to answer.
Thanks so much, Joko. We have time for just a couple of questions, and we can talk more during the discussion. I think Anna had a question on whether you had calculated the cost or accounted for the cost of establishing strips or patches, etc. You sort of hinted that in the end, but when you make your artificial landscape, of course, some landscapes are more agronomically profitable than others.
Yes.
So can we put that in the equation as well?
Yeah, that would be very interesting to include. It's not part of the project, but definitely that would be important. In Organic Plus, we were working with farmers with the actually, in fact, without including the economy, because we asked them to discuss which management actions were feasible for them and economically feasible as well as practically feasible. So these are actions that they would use.
Thanks. Anna, you wanted to follow up?
But it's a very good question, I think.
Yeah, well, I actually retracted again, but when we're discussing it now, then so it could be really interesting to know whether the consumers would be willing to pay the additional costs for increasing the biodiversity and all the cost that comes with this, because of course it will cost something somewhere.
Yes, that would be very interesting as well. I
Yeah,
definitely agree.
Yeah, that's an entire project in itself,
yeah,
I guess.
Yeah, but it is also very difficult for consumers to assess what is biodiversity friendly and what is not biodiversity friendly. And this is also why we need this metric which can communicate this across the value chain.
Completely agree. Yeah.
Right. So I propose we move on to Henrik and continue this discussion in the last 20 minutes. Thanks again, Joko.
Okay. Thank you, Quentin. How long time did you say? 20 minutes, or how long time do you think I have?
Yeah, until about 11:40.
11:40, 20 minutes. Okay. So Joko, could you please stop sharing your screen? Yes, perfect. I will try to share my screen. Is it okay for everyone?
Yeah,
Okay.
we hear you and see your presentation.
That's perfect. Well, firstly, thank you for the invitation to join your webinar. I was actually not aware of this series, but I'm sure I will join you at the third seminar for sure. And thanks for the presentation so far. I think there's a very nice red line story. And I will try to follow up on both Niels and Yoko. And to guide you a little bit, I mean, now we are moving into the field, I mean, into the specific fields, large or small, as indicated by both Niels and Yoko. We have very big fields, bigger and bigger fields, due to our mechanization and structure development in the sector. But nevertheless, we have a category that we call a field. And that's where this presentation is focusing on, a strategy intercropping in a field, and basically raising the question whether that is part of the biodiversity discussion. I think that's an open one. But what we are indeed seeing working with this strategy is that there's a lot of functions and services that we introduce to the cropping situation, to the farmer approaches, and that is potentially very beneficial. I will also include value chains. It was also indicated by Yoko. And that is a very important driver for any change. So that would be included. It is my presentation is connected to the EU project, Intercrop Values. It has been running for about 3 years now, and we will finalize in late October this year. I have some co-authors for this presentation here: Fanny, Margot, Marie-Hélène, and Lionel from INRAE. Yeah, some of the work I will present is basically made by them, especially Fanny, who has been working really hard on this for some years now. But what we're talking about is something that I should say also I'm an agronomist by training. So I have this agronomy or agroecology perspective on my findings. So what I can say is that heterogeneity is really not something that we are talking too much about in agronomy, in my understanding or experience. Even though we know that the landscape, the fields, the natural resource space is very heterogeneous. We are using the space as a homogeneous space, because you can see in this picture here we have a lot of cereals growing on a huge area, and we have a lot of trust in our technologies, input possibilities, mechanization, and so on. And we see a lot of disadvantages from that strategy. So in principle, what I would like to introduce to you is this arrow to this richness of different species, crops, that you can potentially grow with a lot of different rootings, shoot characteristics, all able to respond to a lot of different variables that we see in the landscape and also in the specific fields. So that is kind of the thinking when we talk about intercropping. My history is long in this area here, and very much supported by EU projects. So the Intercrop Values project is here, and that is linked to a history of very natural science-based, technical-based approaches, hypotheses, research questions. And then moving, since I moved to Roskilde University about 10 years ago, it's been more and more focused on these terms, multi-actor approaches, living labs, just to highlight that we actually have a lot of answers on how is this done, how can we manage this crop diversification strategy using intercropping. Our challenge is how can we move this into a practice? How can we make this relevant for the farmers practicing land use practices in Europe? So that's just to highlight my travel here, my focus for a number of years. So crop diversification, what are we talking about? We have a temporal dimension. So that is going from a monoculture situation where we have, for instance, wheat following wheat, following wheat, following wheat over 4 years in the same field. That's a monoculture. And then you have a rotation, probably the most basic management that we know in the history of agriculture, that you have different species in different years to avoid pests and diseases. So that is increasing diversity in time. Then we have another dimension, that's space. So that is, if you imagine that you have 2 fields, then you have a field of barley and a field of pea, and then that is what we title a sole cropping situation. When we mix these 2 species into the same field, then we have an intercropping strategy, and that strategy going from sole cropping to intercropping is also increasing the spatial diversity. And doing that, you have a lot of functions and services that farmers are interested in, and the sector are interested in, according to production. So that could be linked to nitrogen facilitation. So there's an interaction between the 2 species growing. I will not go in detail with all these. I'll just use this as examples. So there's an impact on the nitrogen dynamics in the field, in the crop stand. New functions are coming because these 2 species are different in rooting or in shoot characteristics. The same could go for phosphorus and also for water facilitation. So this is just to introduce that we get some functions out of this, some beneficial functions that many farmers are interested in. And some of these, especially in nitrogen, like Niels was indicating, is regulated. So that means that attention to these systems, where you can get a more efficient system, you can get some atmospheric nitrogen down into your cropping system, that is, getting more and more attention. So one more slide on the principles here, just for you to understand the system, the strategy. This is a very old experiment, or this is an experiment. It's not published. Research takes time. This is data from 82 to from 84. It's still in my computer, and one day it will be out published, I hope. But anyway, I use it just to show to you the principles here. So there's an experiment where you have 3 levels of nitrogen application: 0, 40, and 80 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare. I just showed to you here one field or plots with barley, 100% barley, and a field with 100% pea. Because it's on the y-axis, you have nitrogen accumulation totally at harvest. So you can see that in the barley crop or in the field, you have a response of the nitrogen that you apply. So when you apply 80 kilograms of nitrogen, you have a significant higher yield compared to the other treatments. So barley is responding to this mineral applied. In the pea field, you have a higher accumulation of nitrogen totally due to the nitrogen fixation ability of this specific species. But there's actually no significant difference between the different treatments, because the pea crop in itself is responding to the mineral nitrogen. And when there's no mineral nitrogen, it is increasing its nitrogen fixation, meaning that the response at the harvest date is really independent of whatever you have put on the ground as a fertilizer. So obviously you can reduce your fertilizer application here. So if you look at the mixes, then we have different mixes of the 2 components. So that's the intercropping strategies. So when you have 20% of pea in your barley crop stand, so you reduce your barley relative plant numbers with 20%, leaving space for pea moving in, you can see that you actually get the same yield or the same nitrogen yield in your barley crop. So even though you reduce the plant number, then due to the vegetative and very plastic spatial response by this species here, it is actually still taking up the same amount of mineral nitrogen, but on top of that, P is actually contributing with nitrogen from nitrogen fixation, even though P is very, there's a lot of competition against it. You still see a surplus here. And you see another dynamic when you have more pea plants, and a third dynamic when you have more or even more pea plants. Yeah. So you can see there is a dynamic going on depending on the proportion of the two components in the crop stand, but of course also depending on the amount of nitrogen that you offer to the specific plant. So this dynamic response that you get very nicely mimic the situation in the field, for instance, where there's a high level of heterogeneity of also according to nitrogen, but also other parameters. So you're actually introducing a way of responding to the heterogeneity that we see in the landscapes using these intercropping strategies. Okay. So what we do is that we are trying to work with complementarity, and complementarity means that that we have a diagram here where I have just drawn a relative resource profile over the season. So that's could be time or space. And you can see species A are very good in the beginning, are very efficient utilizing the resource. It could be water, it could be light, it could be some nutrients. In principle, it doesn't matter. It's very efficient in the beginning, but there's resources out here that could go potentially for some leaching risks if it's nitrogen again. And if we combine species A with species B here, then we are emptying out some of this nitrogen available later in the season. And we can even combine a third species, so we have a triple intercrop, emptying out the resources in the very end of the season. So that is the principles that we are working with. And biodiversity, why is intercropping interesting? Well, going from 1 to 2 species is, of course, a very simple increase in genetic diversity, I know. But still, what we are working with, at least from a theoretical point of view, is that we have this introduction of intercropping, a strategy. I just pictured it for you. And then we have a plant diversity. So we plan a higher level of diversity that is promoting some eco-functions and services. We can see that in our crop. And it also creates some different responses to the associated biodiversity. And also, like Joko was indicating, if we imagine that we are having a different landscape with smaller units, more habitats, like Niels was indicating, in the landscapes, then that is also influencing the associated biodiversity and also the crop stand or the diversity where we have our cropped fields. So this is the principles. However, as indicated, we have seen and documented for many years, it is indeed doable to have these strategies, but the problem is that it's blocked by what I call purity first processing and retail, connected to what Anders and Joko was just discussing about the consumer. I would say it's even more important to look at the retail part of the value chain. The logistics that we have prefer purity. And I would like to challenge this purity term in the coming slides. We have a situation where we have this ecosystem decoupling. That's my postulate. Niels was indicating and also explained a little bit about the green revolution. So this is a diagram showing maize production in the US. And it's a very principled diagram. I use it very often to explain or to discuss with my students. Then we have the area of maize. That's the red line here. And then we have a production. That's the blue line. And as you can see, there's been more or less an explosion of this yield per aerial unit. And that's due to the inputs that we have, the mechanization and so on. And this development has caused some critical challenges. And these critical challenges is what we've talked about today. Biodiversity loss is of course obvious. Soil degradation, greenhouse emissions, global resilience, and so on. But this is what the market is used to have these very high pure units entering into the market. And what I introduce here, intercropping, is more or less, or at least it's different. It's not completely the opposite, but it's different. We argue in our project, in the intercrop value project, that we can target some of these needs that we have, some of these targets to 2030. That's in 4 years' time, 5 years' time. So 4 years' time. So I will not go into detail. Some of you will know these targets is quite significant. And we believe that our strategy here could be beneficial. And the reason we do it is that, or we have that argument, is also from past experiments from my group and also other colleagues, where we can document. This is a diagram from a huge study from CIRAT in France. They have, piled up a lot of data, and they can see that we actually get what we are asked for by the politicians, diversifying our strategies in the fields. We have a higher productivity. We reduce our need for pest and disease control. We have a better water use efficiency. Water quality is improved because we use less pesticides, for instance, and we can also improve soil quality. So a lot of benefits are available. A lot of attention. This is just did it yesterday. So newest publication records for Web of Science. So you can see there's an increasing interest in the scientific community, supported by funding. So that's have some level of policy attention also. Yeah. So we started this project on this background. It's 3 years old, a classical EU project, and I will focus on the case studies. I'm responsible for that work package. So we have 13 case studies, 10 countries, as you can see here, in Europe, but also in Africa, in Mozambique, and in La Réunion. Different systems, all practicing intercropping of different kinds, because there's different relevance criteria depending on where you are. And we have this ambition to try to learn from all of it. And I'll just highlight a little bit of it in the last, I think, 10 minutes now, 5 minutes. So we have what we call situated cropping systems. So we have cropping systems positioned different places. We have some working with intercropping where they focus on additional crops as service plants. In this case here is a broccoli trial in Spain, where you use veg as a service plant in order to reduce specific pests and diseases, and also to provide some nitrogen, atmospheric nitrogen. Another system is wheat faba bean. And several of the KICS studies or the case studies are using that. Is food plus food, so it's going directly into direct human consumption. And we also have systems where we are combining food and feed. We have no energy, I'm sorry, with Morten and other colleagues. We have no biomass for energy in this project. It's focused a lot on food. We also have a network of actors, of course. So that means we have the different countries here, the different case studies. And on the x-axis, you can see that we have some case studies with farmers included, farmers group, rural development associations, advisory services, other upstream actors. And we also have downstream actors, processors, research and development institute, and so on. And you can see there's a very high richness in this data here, and there's a high level of networks of different actors operating in the different case studies. We have a diversity of situations, although when we wrote the proposal, it's mandatory so everyone to link findings to shorter or longer value chain connections. So we have some case studies driven mainly by public research institutions, could be a university, for instance. We have another group with a farmer, single farmer actually driving it, and so on, business development. It's just, I will just indicate to you the richness of the different situations and the different relevance criteria. in the project. We also have a large diversity in what we call strategy of knowledge production. So this is about meeting in the case studies, interacting with each other, understanding what is going on. There's a lot of different examples here. The y-axis indicate, if you go to the top here, that's where there's a lot of actor involvement, farmer involvement. Some of it is driven purely by these actors in the system where we operate. And there's other less, it's more research driven, and there's also pure research driven approaches. And we place the different case studies, case studies accordingly. So we have some cases with a very focus on production agronomy, and we also have in the other end some working with food professionals developing new recipes or new products. So it's rich again. What we can see, which is quite interesting, is that things are connected. So there's a lot of proximities in these very individual strategies. Past work has been very much focused on farmers, so the production level in the value chain or in the system. But now we have other strategies like developing new recipes or products for high protein content. When that is entering in, looking at the benefits, that is also getting a higher attention from the farmers that we are engaging, and the same for some technical equipment. I'll just show you an example of the sorting part. You can imagine when you have a combine harvesting situation, then when you harvest them with your combine harvester, there'll be a mixed seed in the tank, and that is challenging this purity strategy that we know from our dominating soil cropping system. But there's something on sorting, and also something about inviting these food professionals into the agro world, into the agronomy dominated paradigm, and then they start to influence and to learn from the production part and vice versa. So there's a lot of proximities, even though you have different directions entering into these benefits of intercropping. So this purity first, I started out with that, it's a challenge. Basically, it's not a challenge because we have worked with AGCO. Some of you know this major company. I think it's positioned in Randers in Jutland in Denmark and other places in the world. They know a lot about combine harvesters, so they can adjust it. But you can imagine if you have a handful of seeds looking like this, then there is some sorting to do. This is a radical example, of course. But that is actually Aarhus University, your colleagues from Flakkebjerg just bought this what we call optical sorter. So you can imagine up here, you put your material up here, and then you have a system where you can knock out different colors, different shapes, and so on. And you can train your equipment, so it's very, very efficient, and it's actually very cheap. So we are going from a situation where if the market is asking for a pure material, we can actually do it. It's not that barrier anymore because it's feasible. But what is interesting here, I think, is that the sorting is critical to many of these case studies. Some of them have no, to the left here on your screen, some of them have no sorting requirements, but most of them have sorting requirements moving into the markets that they're working with. And some of them are really not reaching their goals partly because of that. I mean, there's challenges in meeting these value chain requirements originating from the history or the dominating paradigm, having these pure materials to work with. Suddenly we introduce something that is not as pure, and then the market is saying, we don't want to have it on the market, or they charge you a lot, and then that means the business case is challenged. So in these patches of different strategies, we can see that sorting is a challenge, but we can also see that it's actually easy to deal with nowadays with new technology. Anyways, in the project, I'll just finalize in 2 minutes. In the project, we have taken the challenge, saying, okay, fine, we will not use the money to make this pure, 100% pure wheat, 100% pure pea or whatever. We will accept that there is an impurity of maybe 5 to 10%, even less. So when you have wheat for baking, this is biscuits and cooking and so on in France, Kix 4, then there could be like 5% of pea in this flour. And you can see you can make beautiful cakes. In Serbia, it's the same. They produce pasta with 3 to 10% of pea in it. In Germany, they're very advanced. They actually have a premium for including pea in some of the baking wheat that they have. They work together with a big artisan bakery association. And in Switzerland, they can also develop new bread products having a proportion of pea in the baking wheat. And why are they doing it? They're doing it because the quality of the final food product are better. It's improved by the impurity. So that is a key message for me, that if you talk to food professionals, gastronomy, they prefer to have these impurities, in quotes, in the material, because then the product they produce is actually better. So what we do in the project is that we are actually following this classical value chain, linear value chain thinking, but by going vice versa from fork to farm, we get a completely new picture, a lot of possibilities, but we face a lot of conservatism and lock-ins in the value chain that we know the most. So my final slide is to say that when market pulls farmers diversify, and when farmers diversify, then the fields or the landscapes are offering some of these services that we need. But when the markets are not providing any pull, then it's very hard to stimulate these transitions. And my final slide is just to highlight to you that I think Yoko or Nils, I don't remember, talked about this interconnectedness. Of course, when we move into the value chain, this is also a term that we should not forget, that things are connected. This is a complicated diagram. You can see here I've just indicated this agricultural production and some of the environmental drivers that I've been looking for in my career. But of course, this is connected, and before we are able to connect it and share knowledge, this interdisciplinary and the social science contributions, then in my mind, it's a challenge for us to make the transitions that the society and policy are expecting from us. And this is all my colleagues in the project. So thank you for the attention.
Thanks so much, Henrik. We only have a little bit more than 10 minutes left, so maybe we move to the general discussion. And maybe a question to get you started is, as far as we are scientists, do you think we have enough information to already act, or is there more research that needs to be done in this field?
From a technical point of view, we have the information needed. We need more knowledge transfer to other parts of the value chain, like Anders was indicating this about the consumer. That's at the very end. But there's a lot of things going on from the field, from the landscape to the consumer, and there's a lot of knowledge inside that system, or there's lacking of knowledge inside that system. So when you argue with a person from a retail company that they should pay more for some ecosystem functions and services, they will not know anything about what you talk about. So there's a need to improve our sharing of knowledge across the value chain. From a technical point of view, And from a food professional point of view, basically we know enough, but the implementation is really a challenge.
Thanks. Anders?
Yeah, hi Henrik. Thanks for a nice presentation. I think maybe we still lack some data and information about for example, when you're talking about impurity. When you increase the impurity, I see your rationale for doing that, and then you do that by increasing your crop diversity. But what does that mean in terms of diversity of the intrinsic population of animals and plants?
That's true, and that's a little bit beyond my academic expertise. So I would probably say that field size is probably more important than in-field crop diversity. What I can say about by the in-field crop diversity, that is from a input point of view, from an agronomic input point of view, very significant. But the connection to the landscape, to the broader biodiversity discussions, I think I should leave the floor to Yoko or Nils.
Thanks.
Yes, Yoko, please.
Yeah, just to give some input on that last question, I think that intercropping could hold great potential for biodiversity. I mean, given that these edges between different habitats promote biodiversity, but also because some of the plants that you use, I was specifically interested in this service crop you introduced because it could be beneficial for flower visiting insects, for instance. If you can use plants like that within the crop field, then you could definitely increase biodiversity. And something which we have not touched upon in this webinar, but which might be the subject of the next one, is that biodiversity can also have some economic effects because, for instance, in production, you can have natural enemies of pest species, which actually have a positive effect on production and pollinators as well. So if you can increase that kind of organisms by having intercropping, then you really have a win-win situation.
In intercropping literature, there's a lot of pollinators because normally when you have your grain legumes growing, then there's a very high impact if you have successful pollination. So that's very well described, I think. And then we also collaborate with the conservation agriculture farmers, leaving the residue on top of the soil, and we can also see some interesting functions from that.
Yeah, and I think that's also very beneficial, for instance, for spiders and beetles, which live on the surfaces, so that they're not plowed or tilled.
Yeah.
Thanks. And Yoko, sort of going beyond intercropping, it's also a question Morten asked, is in your own field, how much more knowledge do we need? I think Morten asked whether modeling approach is sufficient given the knowledge we have, or what need is there still to monitor biodiversity kind of with boots on the field?
Yeah, well, of course, I mean, modeling depends on the quality of the data that the models are built on. That goes for all models. Our particular models, we model species that we know very well from the literature. And of course, we try to use good quality data, but at least we model species which are well known, not rare species, but species which are representative of certain species groups and functions. So they're very well described. The idea about creating these landscapes and looking at the landscape structure in ecometric is that we do not go into knowledge about biodiversity in those particular landscapes, but we use the structures and the composition of the landscape. And actually, when I read the question, I was a little bit in doubt of whether you were thinking about the different quality of these different habitat types, because of course, I mean, when you have semi-natural habitats, you can have very different qualities, and also, I mean, representing different habitat diversity. So, I mean, if you have a semi-natural habitat, it can be rather boring, poor habitat, but it can also be a very rich one, which can house many different species. And that is a parameter that we do not include at the moment in the econometric, because we only include the composition and the configuration of the landscape. But of course, this is something that you could also include if you know more about it, the quality of the habitats.
Yeah. Thanks.
But this is actually where I would really like you to visit the Innovation Center for Organic Farming's website and see these videos where you can see how can you improve each of the area types for promoting biodiversity.
Thanks. Between the three of you, do you think there are, Niels, you had something to add to that maybe?
Yeah, it's concerning the need for more research. People who are not researchers will expect researchers to claim that we need more research. So we should be careful about that argument. But I would say that, for instance, when Vejle, the city in Denmark, was flooded, was it last year, due to bad water management in the landscape. I mean, in that case, certainly it's possible to model the hydrology and find the optimal solution so we can avoid flooding cities and other places in the future. We'll have to do something about water management on farmland. So that can be modeled, and we could have some hydrology engineers figuring out exactly what to do. That's not the case for biodiversity. We cannot find out exactly what to do. So that's why I argued that let's just get started, but it can hardly be any worse than it is today. Whatever we do to improve, we'll make an improvement. So let's do some experiments here and there in this green tripartite and follow what's happening and use what we learn to find out where we go next. Let's not try to be very technocratic about it and make like a blueprint for all of Denmark. It's not necessary and it's not possible.
Thanks. Anders?
Yes, it's a question for Yoko. So I noticed these very nice videos of the beetles. They how the population was changing during the season, and I got a feeling at first glimpse, yeah, they are moving forth and back and to survive. But is it because when it seems like they're moving towards the hedges, is it simply because they are killed? And their life, what shall I say, support in terms of stable soil conditions and food and so on is simply vanishing due to plowing and harrowing and so on and pesticides.
I don't really get why they would be killed in the hedgerows.
No, not
he
in,
meant
but
outside
in the
of
field.
them, I think.
Yeah, inside the field.
If they disappear.
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah, well,
exactly.
I guess that's modeled as well. I don't know if Trine is here because the
Yes,
specifics
yeah.
about the,
Do you hear me?
the modeling, maybe she can better answer.
You don't?
We hear you.
No,
It's
okay.
a very hypothetical question. I don't know.
So are they moving because of their behavior, or are they disappearing from the fields because they are plowed down to grow the straw and everything? So what's...
Yes, they are. You see them starting out in the edges because that's where they can overwinter, and then they go out into the field, and then they will be killed by the plowing, for example.
Okay.
And then they disappear. Yes.
Okay, that's a clear answer. Thanks.
Thanks. Do we have any last point or last discussion starter? So we're reaching the end of the webinar. I'd like, on behalf of CBIO, to thank the three speakers, but also the people who organized it as well with me, Stina, Morten, and Anders mostly. So thanks again, everyone, for your attendance, and stay posted for the last and next and last webinar in the series. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.